Are you looking to learn more about investing in the Central Indiana real estate market? You've come to the right place. Welcome to the Indy Real Estate Investing Podcast with T&H Realty, where we discuss all things related to investing in the Central Indiana real estate market. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Indy Real Estate Investing Podcast with T&H Realty. I am your host, Jeremy Tallman with T&H Realty. We are a residential property management company that services the Central Indiana market. Our topic today is HOA rental restrictions, and our guest is someone who's had experience on both sides of that topic, and that's attorney Matthew Griffiths with Griffith's Xidias Law Group here in Indianapolis. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Matt, you've been a big part of our industry for a long time now. But for those people, yeah, I relate. But for those people out there who may not know you, can you provide some just quick background of how you got your start and what you do today?
I've been a real estate and business lawyer for 30 years. I started practicing in 1992, and I practiced in Richmond, Indiana for a while. Actually, I worked for some judges right out of law school while I was studying for the bar exam. And then I joined a small firm, actually just one lawyer. It was kind of funny. It was a gentleman named Phil Thrasher, who was the first legal affairs chairman for a group called the Indianapolis Landlords Association.
Yeah.
And our firm was Thrasher and Associates. And I was the only associate. So I was all of them. I was all of the associates. And then we added some more people and started a firm in 1994, like January 94. I became a partner and took off. And then 2010, I left that firm and started my own practice, separate firm. Yeah. But Phil Thrasher turned the Indianapolis Landlords Association over to me in probably like 96, 95, 96. And I was legal affairs chairman for that group for a long time. And then I helped reorganize the group into what is now CIREA, Central Indiana Real Estate Investors Association. They came, they had a change in leadership, and wasn't real thrilled with some of the stuff being taught from the podium. I think it's easier to do the right thing and sleep well at night rather than cut corners and do things that are unethical and illegal. And I didn't like what was coming out of the podium. So I left the group and started another group, and Steve Richards joined me, and I've been around for a long time. I've written, I've spoken at national RIAs and regional RIAs and other state RIAs. I've been around a while. I've done a lot of real estate investing.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, Scott, my business partner, and I, we started in this industry in 2000 is when we bought our first rental property and started buying a bunch more in that time frame. And at the time we became a part of ILA. Right. So I remember that. And I think as I think back, we talked about this briefly last week, you and I probably met at one of those meetings. And as we were building our business, we're like, hey, we need an attorney because, we go by at that point, you went and bought a book with a lease in it and, it was perforated and you made photocopies of it. And right. And we're like, we probably need, as we started getting more and more properties, it's like, we probably need to get an attorney and create a lease. And the funny thing about you and us is I actually went to your office, and I think we had a meeting, you and I did. And what happened, I believe, was that you got called out to court or something, but they're like, hey, we have this other guy and he can help you. And he became our attorney. Stephen Earnhardt became our attorney at that point. So
Steve's a good lawyer.
Yeah, we just missed each other. I guess it would have been totally different. But so anyway, Matt, we talked or I sent you some information. One of the things we like to talk about on our podcast before we get into the rental restrictions is some numbers. And you seem to be very in tune with numbers and just trends about real estate. And so I sent you a couple of things to look at and wanted to kind of get your take on it. I'll start with some numbers that we get every month from MyBor. We're MyBor members, and they send out numbers on the housing market. And it's been like this crazy, upward swing in the housing market for the last few years. And so the numbers that came out early this month of June of 2022 was that the median sales price for Central Indiana is now $300,000. It's a new record for us. And accompanied with that, from June of 2021 to June of 2022, our median sales price increased by 19.8%. So essentially 20% year over year. So those are impressive numbers by themselves. But the two that I wanted to kind of maybe dig into a little bit, maybe you have some thoughts on, are that listings did increase from June of 2021 to June of 22 by 10.8%. So nearly 11% we increased number of listings. But accompanied with that is that sales actually decreased by 6.3%. What do you make of those numbers? I mean, so we got these, this a new record of sale price, $300,000 median sale price, Central Indiana. But yet it does appear that sales are slowing. So just give me your take on that if you have one.
Okay, so I'm a big believer in economics, basic principles of microeconomics. First rule of economics, right? Greed works. People are motivated by money. Mm-hmm. But supply and demand, Adam Smith, The Invisible Hand, wrote that book. And it's true. You cannot deny supply and demand. So what has happened is we have an undersupply. A lot of people are worried because 2008 is still close enough in our rearview mirror that people worry about that crash. That crash was the result of government forcing the market into a situation where there were too many buyers. And what happened was government subsidized loans to the point where anybody could go get a loan. And so we had too many buyers. And we have a situation today where we have not too many buyers, but too few houses. So I've seen estimates where we're 2.5 to 3.5 million short of inventory, which is crazy. And you can explain, if you look at building permits and just construction starts over, say, the last 10 to 15 years, we're way behind. We got 331 million people in this country. So the demand for housing has steadily gone up, but the supply of housing has not kept pace. So we have a housing shortage right now. Okay. So how does that explain current trends? Well, it doesn't. So you have to divorce long-term economic trends, supply and demand, and those types of hate to say macro factors because it's really microeconomic concepts from immediate changes in the market. So the price increases, that's a result of two things: inflation, because everything costs more right now. I mean, lumber prices are down. I mean, they're about $600 a thou for a board foot right now, down from their high of like $1,500 a thou. So lumber prices have come down, but not metal, not rubber, not anything petroleum. So it costs more. Go buy a furnace for an average house today, and you're going to pay $2,000 to $4,000 more. So it just costs more to build a house today or to rehab a house today. That puts upward pressure. At the immediate results of market shifts, I think it's just an emotional reaction to interest rate changes. You and I have talked before about interest rates. I remember when I was probably a kid or preteen, my dad had an 8% mortgage on a house. That was like pot of gold in the backyard. He would get phone calls at least 3 or 4 times a week from banks. This is back when you could call people and bug them at home on a landline. And he would get calls from banks and lenders 2 or 3 times at least a week, probably almost every day, saying, "Hey, we can cash you out. How would you like to have, $40,000 of cash? We can get you a new loan." And my dad obviously would ask, "Well, okay, what would my interest rate would be?" And he said, "A low 14.5%.
Right.
And if you told somebody, a buyer today, they were going to pay 14.5%, their head would split open. They just couldn't believe it. They would fall down. Everything's relative. And, think about stock market goes up, stock market goes down. It's not because the companies that are in this, that comprise the stock offerings on the market, are doing poorly. It's just that they haven't met expectations. Right. So that you thought, well, this company is going to make an extra $40 million this year, and they only make 20. They made $20 million more this year than they did last year, and the stock price goes down. Right. So that's almost an emotional reaction to the worth of that company. The worth of that company went up by $20 million, but the stock value went down. That's sort of what happens with interest rates. People freak out. And there's a lot of advertisements on the radio and television and print. Oh my God, interest rates are going up. You better hurry up and get your house.
Yeah.
And the market kind of feeds the hysteria.
Right. I think the first interest rate, my parents' house, the first house they ever bought, they bought it on contract, I believe it was 18%. So that's probably like 1980 range.
Yeah. That was common back then.
Yeah. Yeah. So for us to go to 5 and something, I think Scott and I, our first mortgage was around 8.5% back in 2000. So yeah, right. Money's been so cheap for so long. I think you're right. There's been an initial reaction to the market that all of a sudden interest rates have essentially, doubled, but still they doubled from a very small number. And so there's been a shock to it. So I think that's why maybe sales have decreased.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt that the interest rate increase has freaked people out. And the other thing, market watchers will look at the number of new loans, and they're freaking out because the rate of new mortgages dropped. Well, everybody and their brother refied over the past 2 years.
Right.
At some point, people were going to stop refining. When do they stop refining? When the rate goes up a little.
Right.
Because why would you refi and pay an extra half a point or a point on your mortgage? Unless you just have to suck the cash out.
Yeah.
There's no reason to refi. So of course, when rates go up, there's going to be a market reaction. That's only natural. And I think it's just a lot of hype and a lot of hysteria.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the rest of the year goes and the overall market. But let's move on a little bit to the next topic. And that's something that IBJ came out with a little bit ago. There's an article they wrote that indicated for the first time in decades, Indianapolis actually lost some population. It was nominal. It was 5,600 residents between July 2020 and July 2021, which was in the height of the pandemic and things like that. So I keep on reading these words in the article that it's troubling, it's concerning, because we have had a nice growth period in the last decade up until now. Any thoughts on that? Does that concern you at all? The population?
Yeah, and I don't want to get too political, but I think that the standard of living, the quality of life in Marion County, Indiana has dropped over the past several years. So I was born and raised in Indianapolis, and I've lived other places, but for the most part, Indianapolis has been home. And Marion County is just it's not as nice a place to live as it was, say, 10 years ago. The surrounding counties, what we call the donut counties, the ones surrounding Marion County, many of them are growing really, really rapidly. I mean, have you looked at Avon or Plainfield or Brownsburg or Zionsville? It's amazing how much growth. So we've seen that kind of flight. I mean, back in the 70s, it was called white flight. And it was a lot of white families moved out of Marion County, Indiana, to where they primarily went to Johnson County and Hamilton County. And so the demographics of Marion County changed quite a bit. And I think you're seeing not so much a drop in population in Marion County. I mean, statistics say it's dropped a little bit, but mostly what you're seeing is growth in the surrounding counties because there's so much excitement and everything's new. Everybody wants to go to where it's new, and new restaurants and new parks and new this and new that. There's just a lot of excitement in some of the surrounding counties. I think that's drawing a lot of attention away from Marion County. And Marion County's it's not as clean. It's not as pretty. There's the riots downtown shut down, and COVID shut down town, especially for months. Businesses had boarded up windows, and and then the construction, they decided to rebuild every road at the same time. You can't get from one side of downtown to the other. Right. Then they they made downtown Indianapolis less welcoming. You can't park on the street anymore. Meridian Street is down to essentially one lane north, one lane south because of the bus line. They've not made it user friendly. They've actually discouraged people. Then you add on top of that, COVID shut down many of our tourism industry. That was a big hit. I mean, that was really, really rough because Indianapolis had become a really hot spot for conventions and shows and so forth. So I think it's a perfect storm of bad government leadership, really silly urban planning. And then the attractiveness of surrounding counties. I think it's really hurt Marion County.
Yeah. I live in Marion County, I live near downtown. It was tough when COVID hit and the riots hit. It wasn't a good place to be. It wasn't a fun place to be.
It's not back.
Right. I mean, I feel like it's come. I mean, Bottle Works has been great. Bottle Works is, if you've been to Bottle Works anywhere around there is a ton of buzz down there. I mean, it's a fun place to be.
Yep.
So we'll just see how it works out. I think a lot of those numbers were, I think every urban center in the country has seen a drop in population a little bit. And crime is a big problem. So if you talk to, I'm connected to a lot of people that are campaigning for November. I have a bunch of connections to people. So I talk to people that are running for offices, and the crime situation in Center Township really is out of control. That's really hurting Indianapolis. And, you talk to the average beat cop, and he'll tell you, or she'll tell you, unless somebody has stolen more than $5,000, the police will not arrest the guy. Why not? Because our prosecutor's office won't prosecute those smaller crimes. And so, that trend that we see nationally in big cities where crime is not being taken seriously, it's hit Indianapolis. And it's going to be a big part of the November election because crime is a big, big problem. Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't experience it on like a day-to-day level, but I do know the statistics show that. I'm still very bullish on downtown from where I sit, but I think there's a lot of good things happening. And the infrastructure, though, has been you're right. They've decided to work on basically every road at the same time. And the interstate exchanges now are difficult. We have people that live on the south side. It's hard to get to our office because we're in the Broad Ripple, Meridian, Kessler area. So the 65 interchange not being there has been problematic, but hopefully that goes away soon.
I wish I had been in the construction cone industry about 4 years ago because they've sold a lot of construction cones.
Yeah, they really have. Okay, well, enough of the I guess statistics and things like that. Let's get into the topic today, and that is HOAs and their rental restrictions. Matt, we have a lot of clients, and we have a lot of clients that own in neighborhoods that are governed by HOAs. And we're getting more and more feedback from our clients that they're getting these letters in the mail that says there's a rental cap coming in your neighborhood, and it could be 15%, 10%, that only 15% of homes can be rentals, or 10%, whatever it might be. But kind of give us a brief definition from where you sit of what HOAs are doing today in terms of rental restrictions and how they may affect landlords.
I think they're getting more aggressive. HOAs are in restricting non-owner occupancy, and you got to ask yourself why. They have nothing else to do. Usually HOAs will debate for a couple of days, like what kind of pool skimmer do we put on the swimming pool? Right. Kind of crazy trivial things. That's par for the course for HOAs. But I actually was at an HOA meeting because my old law firm, we represented HOAs, and I'd have to go to the annual meetings. And I remember one meeting, this HOA, they must have debated for 20 minutes whether you cut the grass horizontally or vertically, or do we alternate, or do we do it on an angle? Right. It's like I couldn't believe it. It was like they were paying me to sit there and listen to this conversation. But what's happened nationally, if you want to understand why HOAs are reacting, is Wall Street decided to become landlords. Mm-hmm. And these investment firms, large companies, have invested billions with a B in single family homes. Most of them are starter homes or small second purchase type home, right? So you're talking about 3 and 4 bedroom homes, 2.5, 3 baths, small ranches, but mostly small 2-story buildings. Guess where those are? Those are where HOAs are. And they have sucked up the inventory to the point where first-time home buyers and second-time home buyers have had a hard time. They're competing with a lot of big companies. The inventory is pulled off the market before the home buyer can even get to it.
Right.
And so there's so much money. They're cash buyers, no inspections. They just go in there, no financing contingency. Well, the young couple with their first kid, they can't compete against those buyers. So much of that housing has been taken off the market. Okay. Well, is Wall Street going to live in all those houses? Well, of course not. They're buying them as inventory to permit in rental programs. So the number of homes in those PUDs, neighborhoods with HOAs has increased pretty significantly. There are just more tenants living in those homes.
Right.
And the HOAs, typically when someone buys their own home, they personalize it and they tend to take care of it better. Tenants don't care about your house landlord as much as you do. And so the houses are neglected. The grass gets taller. There's more weeds in the flower beds. There's toys all over the front yard. There's just, beer cans and all the stuff that you don't want to see in your neighbor's yard. It's in your neighbor's yard. And that's because your neighbor is some large corporation that's owned by just a bunch of investors that have no idea that they bought your house, and they stuck a tenant in there. And the HOAs have reacted by putting restrictions on.
Right.
That's what's happening.
Yeah. So I want to challenge that just a minute, because I tried to find some data that would back up what you just said, that tenants don't care as much about homes as an owner occupant would. I think intuitively we may know that, right? Because if you own a home, it's like, well, I have an asset here and I want to make sure it looks good. I take pride in it, things like that. I can tell you, just maybe it's more anecdotally, that we have tenants that take great care of properties, that their properties look great. Their grass is green, even in this type of environment, which is really hard to have green grass here in Indianapolis, and during this drought we're having. But and I'm just asking the question because I don't know the answer, because I didn't try to find it. And maybe there's really no good data out there that would support either argument. But is it a fact that, generally speaking, tenants don't take as good care of properties as an owner occupant?
Well, let me put it this way. I've evicted thousands and thousands of tenants over the past 30 years.
Right.
And that's my anecdotal evidence that I have been shocked at how tenants have treated my clients' properties.
Right.
Just amazing disregard for someone else's property. I mean, it's just amazing to me what tenants will do. And many tenants have an attitude. They don't appreciate what the landlord has done, the risk the landlord takes. A lot of tenants see the landlord-tenant relationship as adversarial.
Right.
And my evidence is anecdotal, but I got 30 years of evictions.
Right.
That tell me that by and large, tenants do not respect an investor's investment in that property and so forth. And a lot of tenants, or a lot of landlords, do not foster the right landlord-tenant relationship. The basis of every good relationship is good communication. And it's phenomenal how landlords just don't talk to their tenants. They don't communicate with them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I trust me. I've seen a lot of homes that were left in very poor shape over the 20 years we've been doing this, actually 22. At the same time, though, I'll say this: we used to be, until it became almost impossible, we used to be big sheriff sale buyers. We bought sheriff sales a lot. And I saw a lot of homeowners do the same things. Now, maybe it was they just gave up, right?
They gave up.
They were just like, we can't afford this mortgage. I can't afford to fix the plumbing. I can't afford to fix the roof, whatever it is. So the house just naturally started deteriorating, and they were just at some point looking for shelter, until they were just forced to leave.
And get this. So a lot of those houses that you saw go through foreclosure, those were tenants who the government turned into buyers. They turned them into homeowners because they gave them no money down loans, no doc loans, which is just amazing. It's like, let's all put on blindfolds and pretend that this borrower has more income than they really have. So a lot of the people that you're talking about that went through foreclosure, they never should have been approved for a loan in the first place. Those were tenants.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're going to have a podcast coming up on sheriff sales because we have some good stories about it. But there were, back in 2010, the sheriff sale today, the sheriff sale was Monday this month. I think there were 60 homes on it. Back in 2010, we go to sales and there were over 1,000. And, because we go to closings and lenders would be bragging about they approved someone at a 450 credit score. I mean, you couldn't rent from us with a 450, not even close to that right now.
Yeah.
So there were just a lot of bad loans.
And that's what happened in 08.
Right.
That's why we had a crash in 08, is because we had tenants who had been given hundreds of thousands of dollars to go buy a house. It's crazy.
Yeah. Really
And they
loans.
And so those people never should have been homeowners.
Right. So the rent, Wall Street has come in. There's no question. They've converted, billions of dollars from bonds to single families.
Yep.
Tell us, what are the most common restrictions that you see? Like, I know you work with some HOAs, you work with a lot of investors. Like, what are the common restrictions that you see that landlords may face out there?
Well, on the rental side, they typically restrict the number of rental units as a percentage. And in a condominium situation, that impacts the ability of the actual homeowners to get loans, to get mortgage loans, because if there's too high of a percentage, and that number has fluctuated over the years, but if there are too many rental properties in a condominium or townhouse type structure governed by the used to be called the horizontal property regime law, but now it's called the condominium law. That changed 10, 15 years ago. But you just can't get a loan if there are too many renters in a condo. Right. You just can't. And so condos have restricted the number of renters for a long, long time. But now you're seeing it in the PUD, the typical single family planned urban development type neighborhood, right? The one with cul-de-sacs and the swimming pool and that type of thing. So yeah, you're seeing restrictions there. And that's, again, a reflection of Wall Street coming in and just buying up too much inventory and turning all those houses into rentals.
Right. So rental restrictions have been around for a long time. I do remember one that we had that probably the most difficult to navigate. It's been quite a while ago, though. I would guess 10 to 12 years ago, where we picked up a property. I believe it was already occupied, and we started managing it. And our client reached out to us and said, "Hey, I got a letter from the HOA. Turns out that before I bought this property, they had just changed the covenants. And this investor lived in California. And she said, I'm required to live in that property for 2 years before I can rent it out."
Yep.
So I've essentially, my lease is no good, and I have to make this tenant leave. Well, that becomes problematic because there's a lease in place. So very long story short, I think both sides lawyered up. The HOA was pushing it hard. They weren't going to back down. My client didn't want to back down, but ultimately what had to happen is we had to stop charging rent. And then the tenant graciously vacated a couple of weeks later, or a couple of months later. So there was this pain that the landlord felt. But so let me ask you this: if you're an investor out there and you like those suburbs, which frankly, a lot of our clients love those suburbs, great schools, you get typically tenants that stay more than a year, families, pride of tenantship, we'll call it, typically take care of the property. What do you advise clients that are going into these neighborhoods to be mindful of? What due diligence do investors need to do to make sure that they're not going to get burned?
Once a week, I get an email or phone call from a client or prospective client. And they say, hey, I got a problem with this guy. And I say, oh, okay. Well, what's your contract say? Hello, you still there, sir?
Right.
It's amazing. And saying, oh, I don't know. I haven't looked at it. I said, or, hey, I got a problem with my business partner. I said, oh, okay. Well, what's your operating agreement or your partnership agreement say? It's like, let's check the sock drawer first. So meaning, why don't we pull out the contract and see what the contract says? And what a lot of people don't understand is that neighborhood covenants, they have this split personality. They're partly real estate based. It constitutes part of real estate and interest in real estate, but it also is a contract. So it falls in two categories, and the contract part of it is just overlooked. So it's really, really important if you're going to buy any property, especially a condo for sure, but even a house in a PUD, you really should, as part of the due diligence period, that means before you get to closing,
Right.
there should be an obligation in the purchase agreement. This starts with the purchase agreement. The purchase agreement requires the seller to provide basic documents, and those include the HOA documents. And you got to read them, and they're not fun to read, but you have to understand that if you're going to buy a house in a neighborhood where there are covenants, you are agreeing to that contract, the covenants. And if you don't read the contract, how do you know what's in the contract? When I was in law school, first day of contract class, my professor said, okay, everybody stand up. So we all stood up. She says, okay, if you've ever entered into a contract without reading it first, sit down. And maybe 10 people sat down, right? Nobody in first semester law school wanted to admit to their contracts professor that they had entered into a contract without reading it, but 10 brave souls sat down. She said, oh, really? And then she went through a series of contracts like, well, how many of you got an oil change? And you didn't read the back of the form you signed authorizing the oil change. And then, about 50 people sat down. So she went through a series of questions like that. And then there were a couple stubborn people who, didn't, we call them gunners, and they refused to acknowledge that they'd ever entered into a contract. But the reality is we all have, right? Shame on us.
Right.
You got to read the contract or at a minimum, turn it over. I hate to say turn it over to a lawyer to read the covenants before you buy a house, but shame on you if you don't. If you don't read that contract, you don't know what you're getting into.
Right.
And if your business model is to rent that property and you don't read the contract, that might restrict your ability to rent that property. That's like, opening a donut shop and not buying sugar, or maybe worse. That's like buying a donut shop, but it doesn't have a front door for the customers to walk through. It's like, how are you going to sell donuts if you can't even get into the place?
Does it make sense? Because from our brokerage standpoint, it's almost impossible to buy a home in the suburbs today. Like, because you just mentioned, I mean, we're competing against owner occupants. We're competing against big corporations that are writing, appraisal gap cover, they're not even getting financing, so it doesn't matter, but it's just hard for us to compete. Yeah. I mean, it's hard for our brokerage and our investors to compete in the suburbs, but would you, because I think I've seen this before, is to have the HOA provide a letter saying you have permission to rent this property. Will HOAs do that? Because I think I've seen it, but I don't know if it's something that could be considered like to put into an investor's practices for having done before they close.
I've seen emails where brokers have asked the HOA to confirm that they'll usually ask for confirmation about the dues, like are there any unpaid dues on the property? And that's a typical process. We've had that for a long time because in theory, unpaid dues constitute a lien against the property. So if you buy a property and your seller did not pay the dues, you inherited those dues. Now, many HOAs won't enforce unpaid dues on the buyer, but they could. They could, because it is a lien.
Right.
Or could be a lien on the property. But I have seen emails where the HOA will confirm, yes, we have no rental restrictions.
Okay.
I have seen that.
Right.
I've not seen it in a formal letter, but I've seen it just in an informal email. It says, yeah, the seller owes $57.16, whatever, for its interest on dues he didn't pay last quarter. And no, we don't have any rental restrictions. Or yes, we do. And here's the waiting list. Or I've seen that. I've seen the
Right.
waiting list.
Right. Yeah. So it's one thing to go into a neighborhood where there aren't rental restrictions, but then 3 or 4 years happen, you've rented it, 3 or 4 years. And this, I think, is a more common scenario that our clients are facing now. You get that letter that says, we're instituting a rental cap and it's 10%, and we're going to vote on that, and here's your proxy, whatever, you can vote if you want. What's the plan at that point? Like if you get that letter, like what's the game plan? Because a lot of our clients are getting those and they're like, it naturally freaks them out. Like, oh my God, they're going to, what do I do here? So what do you recommend as an attorney there? Okay.
So let me answer the question this way. Let's say that you hire somebody to paint the outside of your house, and they agree that they're going to charge you $8,500 labor and materials, and they're going to paint the outside of your house. And then halfway through the job, they come to you and they said, boy, it was really, really hot today. I think I'm going to charge you $9,500 because it's hot. Boy, I didn't realize it was going to be this hot when I painted the outside of your house. I mean, it's really hot. So I'm going to have to charge you an extra $1,000. Well, that's a unilateral change of contract. And unless the contract allows for that kind of adjustment unilaterally, the painter can't just change the contract on you. Well, guess what? HOA is in the same situation. When you get that letter that says, we're going to put this rental cap in place, that is another way of saying, hey, I'm going to unilaterally change the contract on you. Well, you can't do that retroactively.
Right.
The HOA can't do that retroactively. Right. So if you already have a tenant in place, you are essentially grandfathered in. And there sometimes is a battle, depending on how the covenants are written, as to whether once that lease expires, whether the landlord can rent again or they're grandfathered in as a rental. So you have that battle depending on how the covenants are written. But generally speaking, you're grandfathered.
Okay. So maybe I misunderstood or didn't hear you right. But so if I have a property and say the rental cap is 10% and the neighborhood says we're at 12, they do a census and we're at 12%, and then they pass it because, there's got to be some sort of amendment to those, new covenants that come out saying we now have a rental cap. And
that's right. That's your contract.
Right. At least 50 to 75% of homeowners, I guess it depends on how they structure it, has to agree to that change. But the grandfathering I want to talk about a minute, because if you're already over cap and then your tenant moves out, what are you seeing there? Or is it like you can't rent because we're at cap, or we've already deemed you inside it? I mean, what do you?
Yeah, it depends on how the covenants are written or the amendment, how the cap is written. So sometimes it is written such that the property is grandfathered in.
Okay.
Sometimes I've seen HOAs try to say, no, this tenant is grandfathered in. That's unusual. Most of the time it's the property is grandfathered in.
Okay. So it's grandfathered in until it may be sold to an owner occupant, then it kind of resets itself at that point.
Yes.
Okay.
And the devil's in the details. What's your contract say?
Okay. So yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice, because we're even getting some concerns from homeowners or investors rather, on renewals. It's like, I don't know if I can renew my lease. And I'm like, well, I think you probably can, but I think it's, again, goes back to what does the contract say?
What does your contract say? Right. And you got to read your contract, just like the painting scenario. So you pull out your contract and you say, well, here's in paragraph 18, it says the painter can propose a change order, or I can propose a change order, but it says we both have to agree I'm looking at my fictional contract in my hand. You probably can't see that. But paragraph 18 says that we both have to agree to any change in the contract. Well, that's good to know. Let me see what my covenants say. So you whip out your covenants and you turn to page 38 because they're always long, right? And you got to figure out which contract says. It's a contract.
And obviously it's in the investor's interest to vote. If they do, they're going to call a vote if they have to change and create an institute a cap to make sure they're present and not present, but at least they vote by proxy and things like that. So
I'm kind of a libertarian at heart, not in the political party sense, right? Because nobody votes for libertarians. They always they're a distant fourth in the three party race every year. But I do believe in limited government and the ability to enter into my own contracts as long as I'm not hurting somebody, right? I mean, that's where you cross the line where you do bad stuff and you hurt people. If you hurt people, I don't think that's permitted, right? But I generally think we ought to be free to do what we want to do. Covenants are a restriction on that, but it's voluntary. Like you cannot buy that house in that neighborhood because you don't like those restrictions. You can go to another neighborhood, look at the covenants, but that's not what people do in the real world. So investors find a house and they say, oh, this would be a great rental property. And they don't take the next step to say, well, what's the contract I'm entering into with my neighbors and the HOA if I buy that property? And if you read that contract and you're unhappy, or if it doesn't meet your business plan needs, don't buy that property. But investors are just not taking that extra step to figure out what it is they're actually buying. Those covenants are part of it. And it really is a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, it restricts your freedom, but on the other hand, it maintains your value, your property value. I own property in Florida. Mm-hmm. I have a townhouse on 30A in the Panhandle. And I have a neighborhood Nazi. She's the property manager. I get an email from her once a week. If there's a trash can I got fined $10 this year. My property manager's paying the fee because they didn't pull the trash can in within the 3-hour time limit. It's amazing how I'm telling you, I get an email once a week. Her name is Carol. Good old Carol. Carol says, someone left a flip-flop by the swimming pool. And if it's not picked up by the owner, in the next 3 hours, we're going to discard it. She's just crazy. Like they just police the neighborhood. And on the one hand, it annoys me. Right. But on the other hand, I say, wow, that's why that property has appreciated that and other market factors. That property has appreciated $900,000 in 4.5 years.
Yeah.
And it's because the quality of the housing has been maintained. You drive through that neighborhood and it looks just like it did 4 years ago.
Right.
And it's because of the policing by the HOA. So it's a double-edged sword. I really like that. I've more than doubled my money. I've tripled my money on that one property, which is awesome. But I also had to endure the annoying emails from Carol,
right,
about how, right?
Yeah,
I have this
a pretty good trade-off.
relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds like a pretty good trade-off from a financial standpoint. But okay, so I think it's the takeaway there is that you got to read your covenants restrictions. You got to know if your property is grandfathered in. I think that's a really key point, and not just your tenant, because if your tenant's just grandfathered in, then you may have issues when that tenant moves out that you may need to dispose of the property. So I think that's really good stuff to look at, and it's really up to the investor to dig into it to find out.
There's another option, right? So I've done this before, and this is not a perfect solution, but so in Indiana since 1974, I think it was 74, there was a case called Skinsel v. Marshall. And that case was the first time in Indiana where the Indiana court said a land contract is to be treated like a note mortgage. And so effectively, a land contract is a transfer of everything but legal title. So all title, what we call equitable title, the ability to use the property, the ability to hang up a picture in the living room, the ability to have your friends over for a barbecue, all of that, all use of the property is transferred over to the land contract buyer, except legal title. So legal title remains with the seller, and that is akin to a mortgage that a bank has. So you put the land contract, the land contract roughly is like a note mortgage that the bank holds. Okay. So under Skinsel v. Marshall, that's a sale. That's a sale. So if the HOA knocks on your door and says, hey, we've had a rental restriction in place for the past 3 years, and you bought your place 2 years ago after the restriction and you're over the cap, we just learned yesterday that you have a tenant. So you're in violation of the covenants. We need you to do something about this. One thing you could do, it's not a great solution, not a perfect solution, rather than kick the tenant out and deal with, have to put the property on the market and all that, is to convert that lease. If the tenant wants to buy the house, turn it into a land contract. I've actually done that for clients where we knew the tenant had no intentions of buying the place.
Right.
Now, you don't want it recorded. You want to put specific language in that says they shall not record. And you got to deal with it. It's not awesome because then you got to deal with foreclosure. And if the tenant buyer stops paying you and files bankruptcy, they're treated differently in bankruptcy court than under a lease. There are definitely drawbacks. And there's actually an article, I think there's an ebook. There's an ebook on my website about lease options and land contracts. I've had the worst land contract cases in Indiana history. I had a case. There's a reported appellate decision, Carter v. Dempsey. The Carters, I met them at Indianapolis Landlords Association. Okay. They were clients, and this is a reported decision, so I'm not giving any secrets out. I sued a lawyer who was buying their property on land contract, and he drug that thing out for 2 years. It took 2 years to get the property back.
Wow.
Yeah. That was a perfect nightmare scenario. So in a sense, I'm not a big fan. I just told a client yesterday that we were not going to sell one of his properties on land contract because there's so many downsides to land contracts. But if you're in a pinch, that might be a solution to get out of the renter's cap.
Yeah, it could be a release valve there. I see that. Yeah.
If you want to keep it. Otherwise, you negotiate a deal with the tenant, you get the tenant out, and then you put the property on the market. And in this market, you're going to sell it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the one nice thing about this market is that, if you have to sell something, it's not a bad place to be in the market, especially if you bought it, even a year ago. You're probably going to be okay, but it's still painful because maybe you want to keep that for your child's education. You sell it 10 years when your child's ready to go to college and sort of thing.
Yeah. If you have any gain, you're either paying taxes or you got to do a 1031 or something.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So let's say that I'm on the outside looking in and I bought a property and I screwed up and I didn't read my covenants and restrictions, and my property manager puts the home on the market for rent, and then they get a call from the HOA saying you can't rent in this neighborhood, we're over the cap. Is it worth a fight? I mean, is there any, besides, trying to sell it, just going and selling it again? Is there just looking for any recourse at all? Or is it just an uphill battle at that point?
What's the contract say?
Says it can't rent. Right. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So, it depends on the answer to that question is, are you right or are you wrong?
Right.
And if you're wrong, then you got to come up with plan B, which is negotiate a settlement with the HOA. Fine. Let this tenant finish. There are only 3 more months on the lease. Let the tenant leave peacefully. And then, I'll do something else. or convert to a lease option, or I'm sorry, convert to a land contract, or put the property on the market.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's right. It's not a good place to be in. And again, I think it just comes down to doing your homework to make sure that you're in compliance and you can rent it, and that hopefully that your HOA will, if they do adopt a cap, would adopt the property and not the tenant, so you can continue to rent it for as long as you choose. So, well, hey Matt, this has been great. I appreciate you jumping on. Just a couple more minutes here. I just don't know what, since I got you on here, you're an attorney, but 30 years experience. What else are you seeing out there that, landlords or trends in law or legislation or whatever that you're seeing out there, being in court a lot and working with a lot of clients, and that people may need to know about or find helpful here?
Yeah. So there seems to be a surge of discrimination cases right now. I'm not sure why, but there's a surge of claims. Most of them are just complete nonsense. So I have one I'm litigating right now where we evicted this guy in small claims court, and he filed a counterclaim in the small claims court. This guy sublet the property. It's a single family house. He turns it into a triplex, right? And then he one or more of his subtenants aren't paying the rent, so he decides to turn off the water and the heat in January in Indiana. Yeah. And then he builds a wall. The tenants keep turning the thermostat up. And so he builds a wall and he isolates the furnace so they can't get to it. And he disconnects the gas and he disconnects the water supply to the house. So they call my guy and say, hey, right, I don't have any water. I don't have any heat. You own the property. So we file for an emergency eviction, and the judge gives it to us. And in the hearing, this guy files counterclaim and says, oh, they're discriminating based upon my mental condition. What mental condition? That is so common. Tenants will throw anything at a landlord as a counterclaim, and discrimination is just an easy one. It's an easy one, right? And there are a lot of people I think are crazy, but I don't know if they have a medical diagnosis. Right. I just think they're irrational, uneducated, ill-informed people. That doesn't make them crazy. I mean, crazy in the sense of they have a mental or emotional condition that would satisfy the requirements of discrimination, right? I mean, there are a lot of people I think are crazy, but I don't think that by me treating them a certain way, I'm discriminating against them, not in the legal sense. So there just seems to be a lot of that. It's just really easy. And I think there's a heightened awareness of race right now. Mm-hmm. And so you see a lot of that. What's crazy is even my clients that are African-American, they're Black landlords, they're even getting accused of racism by Black tenants. And it's just, that just seems to be on everybody's mind right now. Just a heightened state of alertness for race. That's a problem. And here's the other one. In the past 10 years, we've had a lot of new rules about registering, giving notices to tenants. And I don't think landlords know all the rules. I'm still amazed at how many landlords don't understand the 45-day rule, the security deposit rule. I mean, that's just incredible to me. They don't understand those rules. So landlords need to be, especially first-time landlords. I say first-time landlords, but I got clients that have been doing it for 10, 12 years, and they still don't know the basic rules of landlording. They don't know the laws. So, if I went into glass making or some new industry, right, I would probably spend some time figuring out what the rules are before I went into that industry if I didn't have experience in it. That's a huge mistake that investors make. They don't take the time to figure out what are the rules. What are the rules? What are my restrictions? What are my obligations? So they get into it, and then those translate into unexpected costs, right? So one way or another, if there's a restriction or an obligation placed upon you, that's going to cost you money, and that probably didn't fit your business model. So knowing the rules before you get into the game, I think are really, really important.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we see that too, where as a property manager, we are under a lot of scrutiny to, we just have to treat everyone the same. And it goes from screening as a no brainer. I mean, you have to have the same screening requirements. And it's kind of scary. Like you mentioned, I've met landlords locally and they say, I always want to meet my people. I always want to shake their hand, look them in the eye, and I'll get a good feel if they're going to be a good tenant or not. And I'm like, boy, that is just a bad way to do it.
It's a horrible way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know if you did. This is what I've told for 30 years. I've told clients to do this. I tell them to have a objective rent criteria that's written on paper for every single door they have, right, on a per door basis. Because, I had a rental property years ago in Fountain Square, and I don't remember what the rent was there, $600-700 a month. Mm-hmm. But I also had rental properties in Castleton, and I was $1,400 a month for those. They were very, very different properties, And I had a rent criteria. So I wanted to see so many years on the job, no evictions. I had higher criteria for my nicer properties and lower criteria for my not so nice properties. Right. Okay. And I wanted a different class of tenant for my expensive properties. Right. And I had those in writing. And I would email them to somebody just so there was a paper trail showing that I had those in place beforehand.
Right.
And then I followed them religiously.
Right. Yeah. I definitely have heard of that strategy. We have uniform screening requirements. They're on our website. We don't hide from them. We enforce them. But I definitely have heard of rental requirements, which is perfectly legal to do. You just, because even it's probably more applicable maybe for, a big multifamily owner that has, a 400 unit building in Gary, let's say, or a 400 unit building in downtown Indy. They may have different rental requirements for those buildings. But the thing is, it just has to be consistent. So you can't, in that same building, you can't apply different criteria.
I think the key is that it's objective and it's in writing.
Right.
There's a paper trail.
Right.
Right.
And then maybe more importantly is it's enforced that way, because it can be written and your staff not enforce it, or you not enforce it. But it just permeates everything we do in terms of how we handle maintenance, how we handle late fees, how we evict people. It's got to be very consistent in how we approach. So, but okay, well, certainly it's a thing to be on the lookout for. It's something that I don't know that we've seen a tremendous increase in it from where we sit, but I can certainly see it does come around once in a while where discrimination is claimed. It's mostly just empty threats that, hey, I've been discriminated against. It's like, no, not really, because your credit score was X. That's a very objective measure, or your income was X. We mostly get it on the application side where people are denied. It's not frequent, but it does happen occasionally. And it's as long as we can lean back to it and say, this is what it is, and this is what you were, it becomes very straightforward for us.
I see it after the tenant has breached the lease some way.
Okay.
And they're mad. Yep. And they're mad that the landlord is actually enforcing the contract.
Right.
And that's when the discrimination pops up.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, hey, Matt, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate
my pleasure.
Your knowledge. If people want to reach out to you, if they don't have an attorney, need an attorney, how could someone reach out to you and start a conversation about engaging your services?
I would encourage them to go to our law firm website. It's indybizlaw.com, INDYBIZLAW, indybizlaw.com. So on there, all my contact information is available. But then in addition to that, there's quite a few articles, ebooks, and videos about asset protection, estate planning, investing, landlord-tenant issues. There's a bunch of stuff on there. So it's a good resource for business people and investors. Right. So that's probably the best place to go, indybizlaw.com.
That's a good domain. I mean, that's a really good domain. You must have snapped that up early on.
I did a long time ago. I told you I was old. I'm so old. I got here before the internet.
Right. That's right. Well, hey, Matt, this has been great. I hope everyone's picked up, some knowledge tidbit or two that'll help them in their investing. We'll be back next month with another podcast. In the meantime, we encourage you to share this podcast with your investing friends. Leave us a review and don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and please stay invested in your investment.